Good afternoon, class. Thought we'd get started right away here. I want to put some finishing touches on the comments that I began in class today. And so I'm not going to linger too much on what we've already covered for the sake of time and expediency, but if you were there, these slides ought to make sense. And if you weren't, you can jot down these notes and perhaps consider coming to office hours and catching up a little bit on what we talked about in these different um, elements. We're talking today about mass society and this sort of new scale and function of society that emerges alongside the second industrial revolution of the late 19th century. And we'll pick up here with the social structure of the mass society. And this has a lot to do with notions that are or concepts that are still relevant today. I was just reading an article, in fact, yesterday, talking about how the notion of the American middle class is something that's sort of mystifying. There's people all over the map in terms of their socioeconomics who consider themselves to be a member of the middle class, and it's an imprecise term, but we can nonetheless look at the early industrial period, the second industrial revolution, and make some meaningful clarifications about sort of what the composition of the class structure was there. So the social structure, we start with the upper class, which really is about 5% of, in this case, the British population. And I put in parentheses here means of production because what made the upper class was really their critical control of the means of production. And really there's two different categories there. There's the plutocrats, who have wealth but no like traditional aristocratic title. That's largely because they're part of the bourgeoisie and they have earned their wealth largely as a result of the industrialization process. And so they control the means of production like we might think of factories and things of that nature. The aristocrats, by contrast, are still members of the upper class, but the means of production largely that they control or have traditionally controlled is land. And so they're going to be parts of, the like formal aristocracy. They have titles, but now that they live in this new industrial capitalist economy of late um, late 19th century Great Britain, their wealth is going to, in many cases, pale by comparison to their plutocratic counterparts. And then I just mentioned here one of the ways to combine the pros and cons of these two. The plutocrats have wealth but no title, and the aristocrats have title but no wealth. So we see instances of intermarriage that sort of bridge these two perceived gaps. And one of those is when the American daughter of the Vanderbilt estate, the robber barons, the capitalists of the U.S., the Vanderbilt family. Consuelo Vanderbilt, their daughter, marries the ninth Duke of Marlborough in Great Britain, and together they accomplish, sort of, they're an early example of an industrial era power couple, I guess you could say. The middle class, by contrast, is still relatively small, but certainly bigger than the upper class. About 15% of British society. And I put here, these people are making their way through the industrial era by virtue of their minds. So their skills, so they might be clerks, they might be doctors or physicians, they might be shopkeepers, so on and so forth. These are the people who make their livings with their minds. And they tend to be pretty well off. If you were a middle class member of the British industrial era, you probably would be pretty content with your position within society. You could consider yourself to be part of the top 20% of your fellow Brits. And really, a lot of the sort of notion of Victorian ideals and Victorian sensibilities, standards of behavior, conduct, decency. A lot of these are being targeted toward the middle class, and they become sort of the reputable examples of what it means to be a good British citizen. And so there's even advertising that reinforces and plays upon sort of the peer pressure of what this middle class ought to do in order to be a good Brit. And there's partly the recognition that they have the means, they have sufficient leisure so that they can focus upon these finer points of being a good member of British society. And then finally here we have the lower class, which is about 80% of British society. These are the people working in the factories. Some of these people aren't working at all, and you can see in this depiction, this engraving, that there's some debauchery happening, and of course there were regular efforts to sort of villainize this type of behavior. It's part of the efforts to apply pressure and maintain expectations among the middle classes by making examples out of the lower class. But it's worth noting that a lot of the benefits and breakthroughs of this mass society and improvements that are made in urban housing, improvements that are made in the layouts of these newer modern cities, they're happening largely as ways to improve the lives and improve the existence of this lower class. And as I mentioned in class today, this probably has something to do with the reasons why some of Marx's predictions and forecasts about capitalism have not yet come into being, partly because, as I mentioned, capitalism and the ravages of the industrial process were starting to become kinder and gentler toward the working class or the lower class by the late 19th century. Okay, moving on. For women, so this is an important part of the emergence of mass society as well, because what we start to see is an improvement in the enfranchisement or the access that lower and middle class members of British society have in terms of their right to vote, and there's similar things happening in the United States as well. So as enfranchisement is growing, there's something of a mass enfranchisement, it won't immediately rush and be extended to women. So women are oftentimes observing and seeing some of the improvements that are happening in the modern mass society, but by and large they still are kept in many ways to the sidelines, largely with efforts to brand them socially and even legally as inferior. Marriage becomes, somewhat oddly, more common during this second industrial revolution, and largely because it's seen as an economic necessity. What we start to see with the rise of wages in both the lower and middle class of both British and American society, there's less of a need for women to work because the wages of a male are sufficient to maintain, by and large, are sufficient to maintain a modest and humble existence within this industrial era. But what that, of course, creates is that if women aren't working, then they become, by definition, increasingly dependent upon the income of the men in their lives, particularly their husbands, but also their fathers, and in some cases, probably brothers. And so the emphasis for women becomes upon a sort of careful domesticity with all sorts of expectations that are placed upon her. In the context of Great Britain, of course, the Victorian standards of decency and nurturing of one's children become really critical aspects. As women increasingly are marrying, this does something to address the social phenomenon of quote-unquote illegitimacy, meaning women who have children without being wed first. So this becomes a little less common as marriage becomes more common. Contraceptives are becoming more of a mainstream thing. They're actually latex rubber condoms that are coming online by the mid-19th century, and so these become a part of the second industrial revolution, which helps sort of, it doesn't completely solve, but it helps lower the birth rates within industrial societies. And then family planning, which begins out of some of the reform efforts of the late 19th century mass society. It initially targeted the lower class and was an effort to sort of fight poverty by keeping families that couldn't afford children from having children in the first place. But some of the benefits of family planning, particularly in the context of an industrial society, those are spreading to the middle class as well and becoming celebrated in many respects, certainly taken advantage of, used, and put to work, such that birth rates are going to fall. So gender, and of course when we use the term gender, what we're referring to is sort of the social significance that a society attaches to one's perceived sex. Traditionally, this is thought of as male and female. Those are sexual designations and categories that our society has put forth. Of course, those categories are being revisited and carefully revised in some ways, particularly in recent decades. But for the purposes of this conversation, gender is the social significance attached to one's biological designation as either male or female. And so the gender expectation that becomes pretty common within British and American industrial societies is that women have it as their role to protect children from the adult world. And so as women are moving more and more out of the workforce, this isn't happening entirely, but there are greater examples of women moving out of the workforce. As they become more domestic, a huge part of their role is the nurturing of children, the thinking that women's character is superior, they are more, they are purer and more virtuous than their male counterparts, and so logically they should be the ones that are spending more time with children and helping nurture future generations. And toys and games are largely, in the late 19th century, thought of as a means to helping children secure greater knowledge. But what we also see is by the end of the 19th century a concern that as young boys in particular are spending all this time around their mothers and learning virtues and niceties and proper grammar and proper etiquette, that perhaps boys are becoming too soft. So we see these efforts through organized athletics, through organized scouting expeditions and excursions into the wilderness, an effort to sort of quote unquote toughen up young boys. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt at this same time in history, he starts to argue in the United States that military service and actually having wars is a critical element because it teaches young boys how to become men and how to become more virile and more masculine. So that's sort of a complicated gendered explanation here. And let me finish up by saying that in the working class, we already mentioned how a lot of lower class women and middle class women are being pushed out of the working sector by increased wages. Children become dependents. They begin to become thought of as dependents and sort of burdens. And so even the working class will start to have fewer children because they become so expensive.